The ambulance bay doors at Hartfield Regional Medical Center blew open at 3:22 in the morning, and the man on the gurney was already losing the argument with his own body. Blood had soaked through field dressings on his right shoulder, packed tight, military style, the kind of work that bought time rather than fixed anything. The two paramedics pushing the gurney moved fast, but they were leaning slightly away from the animal walking alongside it, and that lean told Dani Prescott everything she needed to know before she'd even registered what the animal was. 80-something pounds of Belgian Malinois, no leash, no handler, moving in perfect lockstep with the gurney like it had been welded there. Its ears were rigid, its eyes swept the bay in tight controlled arcs. When Dr. Harwick stepped forward to receive the patient, the dog's body dropped low and the sound it made wasn't a bark. It was something below a bark, a vibration more than a noise, felt more than heard, and Harwick stopped walking. So did the charge nurse behind him. So did the two techs who'd been ready at the supply cart. So did everyone in the bay except Dani Prescott, who had stopped at the edge of the group, slightly apart, because she was watching the dog and not the patient. She knew that was backward. She knew the patient was the clinical priority. She did it anyway. The Malinois turned its head and looked directly at her. She didn't move, didn't speak, let her hands stay loose at her sides and kept her breathing at the same steady rate it had been before she'd seen any of this. The dog held the look for 3 full seconds, then something shifted, some calibration behind its eyes, and it stepped back from the gurney rail. Not away, not submitting, just enough. Dani was already moving. She kept her right hand visible, her left hand low with her palm turned downward and flat, a gesture she hadn't consciously chosen, one that had lived in her muscle memory for 2 years and come out without a decision being made. She reached the gurney and pressed 2 fingers to the patient's neck without looking at the dog again. "He's tachycardic," she said. "Heart rate's around 115. Pressure's dropping. We need to move him now." Behind her, she heard the specific exhale of people who had been holding their breath. The patient's name was Reed Galveston. That was what the federal transport paperwork said. Name, no rank listed, no unit, no contact information beyond a case number that meant nothing to anyone at Hartfield Regional. He was somewhere in his late 30s, built the way men were built who'd spent years making their bodies useful rather than impressive, and the wound in his right shoulder was through and through with precise field packing that told her someone with real training had gotten to him before the ambulance crew did. He didn't lose consciousness in the bay. He tracked everything with the focused, horizontal stillness of a man who'd been trained not to let his face report his situation. His eyes found Dani twice during the initial assessment and held there both times. Not because she was doing anything remarkable, but because she was the one the dog had allowed in, and he was filing that. The Malinois, someone had gotten close enough to read the tag on its tactical collar, went by Vex. It repositioned itself at the foot of the trauma bay bed and stayed there through the entire assessment, not blocking, not threatening. Present in the specific focused way of an animal that was tracking every variable in the room and had decided, for reasons of its own, that the situation was under sufficient control. Dr. Harwick worked efficiently once he understood the parameters. The through and through had missed the subclavian by a margin he later described as uncomfortable. Blood products went in. Pressure stabilized. The OR was alerted, and by 4:15, Reed Galveston was in surgery, and Vex was on the floor outside the OR doors, and Dani was charting at the nursing station trying to make the paperwork reflect an admission that had no precedent in the hospital's intake protocols. The 2 federal agents appeared at 4:40. The taller of the 2 introduced herself as Special Agent Claudette Ostroff, NCIS, and she had the specific quality of eye contact that communicated authority without performing it. Her partner, Agent Kimball, was younger, compact, and took notes on a tablet without looking at Dani when she answered, only looking up when she stopped talking, which she found mildly irritating and then decided was deliberate. They sat in the family consultation room off the main corridor. The room kept for bad news, furnished with chairs nobody could get comfortable in and a tissue box on the table. Ostroff asked her questions in a practiced order. When had Galveston arrived? Who had been present? What the dog had done? Dani answered everything directly, in sequence, without adding details she hadn't been asked for. Then Ostroff said, "You were the first person Vex allowed contact with." "Yes." In 14 months, Vex has never permitted contact from a stranger without prior introduction from Galveston himself. Tonight was the first exception we've documented. Ostroff paused. "We want to understand why." Dani didn't answer immediately. She looked at the bracelet on her left wrist, a flat braid of olive and black paracord, worn close to the skin, the kind of thing too small to catch the eye and too specific to be fashion. She'd been wearing it for 2 years. She'd stopped consciously noticing it long ago. "That bracelet," Ostroff said. "My brother made it." "Your brother." Dani Prescott, former Army. 6 years as a military working dog handler, 75th Ranger Regiment, out of Joint Base Lewis McChord. She paused. He was medically separated 2 years ago. Training accident. Lost the use of 2 fingers on his right hand. He can't handle anymore. Kimball looked up from the tablet. After he separated, Dani said, "He spent a long time getting back to himself. I drove up from here every other weekend for about 8 months. He had 3 dogs in his care during that period. His own, and 2 he was fostering for other handlers. I learned the signals, not formally, just from being around it long enough." She looked at the bracelet again. "He braided that for me when I left the last time. Said it was so the dogs would know whose hands to trust." Ostroff wrote something. "When you approached Vex in the bay, you used a hand signal." "Yes, the settle command. Palm down, fingers flat, held low. Brody used it 100 times in front of me. She hadn't realized she'd done it until afterward." "Vex's handler uses the same signal," Ostroff said quietly. "He's been working with dogs from the same training program for 6 years. The behavioral profile they respond to, body language scent markers, specific manual cues. Vex didn't register you as a stranger." A pause. "He registered you as someone who smells like handler gear and moves like someone who knows what she's doing around working dogs." The room was quiet. "I've never met him before tonight," Dani said. "I know," Ostroff said. "That's not the issue." She closed her notebook. "The issue is that Galveston was brought here for a reason, and someone outside this building would prefer that he not recover well enough to walk out. Reed Galveston came out of surgery at 7:48 in the morning and was moved to a recovery room on the 3rd floor. Dani should have gone home. She'd been on shift since 6 the previous evening, and the handoff documentation was complex, and the floor nurse on recovery, a steady woman named Flo Burchard, who had been doing this longer than Dani had been a nurse, was more than capable of managing the transition. Dani stayed anyway. She told herself it was because of the chart complexity. She told herself a lot of things. She was reviewing the medication schedule at the nursing station when she noticed Gary Stultz for the 2nd time. She'd seen him at 8:15, a perfusionist from the cardiac unit, access badge legitimate, signing the visitor log for the recovery wing. Perfusionists had reason to consult on post-surgical patients, but the timing had been slightly early for a non-emergent follow-up. She'd noted it without acting on it. At 10:40, he was back. 2 visits to a recovery patient in 2.5 hours, neither during standard rounds, neither preceded by a chart request that would have appeared in the medication queue. She looked at the sign-in log, then she looked at the page before it, the overnight log, and found his name there too, time-stamped at 11:52 the previous evening, 6 hours before Galveston had even arrived. He'd been on this floor before the patient existed. She photographed both pages with her phone, put the log back, and walked to the stairwell. She called the number Ostroff had given her at the end of the interview. "Ostroff. It's Dani Prescott, 3rd floor recovery. I have a perfusionist named Gary Stultz who's visited this wing 3 times in less than 12 hours, including once before Galveston was admitted." She kept her voice level. "He went in 4 minutes ago." A pause, short and charged. "Don't approach him. Don't go in after him. Where are you right now?" "Stairwell B, 3rd floor." "Stay there. I have a unit 6 minutes out." Another pause. "Prescott, does he know you saw him?" She ran the sequence, the log, her angle, the position of the desk. "No." "Good. Stay in the stairwell." She stayed. The 6 minutes felt considerably longer. She listened to the ordinary sounds of the hospital moving through the door, a medication cart, a PA announcement, a pair of shoes squeaking on the linoleum. Normal things, nothing wrong. Then Vex made a sound. It came through the stairwell door, not a bark, not a growl, but a single sharp vocalization that was higher and more urgent than anything she'd heard from him in the bay. A trained alert. A threshold had been crossed, and he was reporting it. Her hand was on the door handle before she'd decided anything. The corridor was mostly empty, an overturned supply cart near the entrance to Reed's room, its contents scattered across the floor, gauze packs, saline bags, a plastic bin of dressings. The room door was ajar. Through the gap she could see Vex positioned between a man in hospital scrubs and the bed, low and absolutely certain in the way only trained animals were. She was already moving toward the room when the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor opened, and Ostroff came through it at a run, weapon drawn, 2 agents behind her. She nearly collided with Dani. "I told you to stay in the stairwell." "Vex gave an alert," Dani said. "I responded to it." "That is not a justification." "No," Dani agreed. "It's an explanation." Inside the room, Gary Stultz was backed against the wall beside the IV stand, both hands up, talking fast in the high-pitched register of a man who'd been caught and had immediately decided that cooperation was his best remaining option. He kept saying he hadn't touched him, had only needed to photograph the chart. Ostroff looked at Dani once, something complicated crossing her face, then moved past her into the room. Through the doorway, Dani could see Reed Galveston in the bed, fully awake, watching everything with the quiet lateral stillness she'd noticed in the bay. His eyes moved from Stultz to Ostroff to the agents working the room, and then they found Dani in the doorway and held there. Something shifted in his expression, the way a patient's face changed when they finally decided they were in the right hands. Vex turned his head toward the door. He looked at Dani for 3 full seconds, then he lay down at the foot of the bed. Gary Stultz had been a perfusionist at Hartfield Regional for 5 years. Clean record, good standing, no flags in any system that would have caused a second look. He had also, for the past 11 weeks, been in contact with a number registered to a holding company operating out of a business address in Reston, Virginia, that listed no principals and no services. The contact had been buried in an encrypted messaging layer disguised as a scheduling app. Ostroff laid this out to Dani in the consultation room at 12:30 in the afternoon, with Kimball on her right and a folder of printed call logs on the table between them. "He says he was paid to access Galveston's chart and photograph 3 specific sections," Ostroff said. "Projected surgical timeline, discharge window, post-operative mobility assessment." Dani understood what that meant without being told. They wanted to know when he'd be well enough to move under his own power, and vulnerable enough to reach outside. "That's what we're working from." Ostroff slid a contact log across the table. What Stultz photographed wasn't meant to end Galveston's life in this hospital. It was meant to establish the window for something that would happen after. "He's a targeting asset," Dani said. "Stultz, he wasn't the threat, he was the intelligence gathering phase." Ostroff looked at her for a moment. "Yes." "Which means the actual threat is still outside. We have a unit watching the building perimeter. We've put a cover story in place. Stultz's badge shows a normal, completed visit. To anyone monitoring externally, nothing went wrong." Ostroff paused, but covers hold only as long as nobody looks carefully. Dani turned the timeline over in her head. Stultz had made contact with someone external, that someone was waiting on information. The window between Stultz being detained and the outside contact realizing something had gone wrong was unknowable, but it was not infinite. "Move him," she said. Moving him changes the documented record. A room transfer propagates through systems. Keeping him in a known location when your inside asset has been compromised is a larger problem than a chart discrepancy. She kept her voice even. "Whoever is running this network knows that Stultz had a window. If that window closes without a report coming back, they'll recalculate, and when someone has this level of planning, the recalculation doesn't look like retreat." Ostroff was quiet. "They don't need inside access anymore," Dani said. "They just need the room number." Ostroff looked at Kimball. Something moved between them that didn't require words. "I'll manage the clinical transition," Dani said. "Tell me where you want him." Moving a post-surgical patient 14 hours out from a through-and-through shoulder repair was not a trivial event. There were monitors to sequence, IV lines to manage during transport, pain levels to reassess after movement. Dani ran through all of it in the 8 minutes between the decision and the transfer gurney arriving, while simultaneously briefing Flo on what to watch for and making sure the floor charge understood the cover documentation without being told why it mattered. Reed was awake through all of it and asked 2 questions during the prep: where they were going and whether Vex was coming. He accepted both answers without argument. When they moved him from the bed to the gurney, he went rigid for 2 seconds, a controlled, involuntary response to something he wasn't going to name. And Dani adjusted his positioning without commenting on it. He looked at her in a way that wasn't quite gratitude, but was in that neighborhood. They moved him to a room on the second floor's east wing, logged under a different designation, with Flo's badge as the assigned nurse on record to break the staffing continuity. It wasn't a perfect solution, it was a workable one. Dani was recalibrating his monitoring leads in the new room when Ostroff appeared in the doorway with the expression that meant new information and not the comfortable kind. "The man Stoltz was in contact with," Ostroff said. "He's been in the area for 72 hours. We tracked the phone metadata. He's been stationary at an address 2 blocks east with a direct sightline to this hospital's main entrance." A pause. "He's been watching the building, and based on what Kimball pulled in the last hour, he wasn't just watching Galveston." Dani looked up from the monitor. "The metadata flagged your badge," Ostroff said. "Extended shift hours on the 3rd floor. You showed up as a continuity flag in the staffing log, the nurse who'd been present through the entire case. Someone was building a picture of who had proximity to the patient. She kept her voice even. They know you were involved." The room was quiet. Reed had stopped watching the ceiling. He was watching Ostroff. "Then we need to know if they'll act on that before your team gets to them," Dani said. "We're executing on the external address in 20 minutes, coordinated with a federal warrant." Ostroff looked at Dani. "In the meantime, I need you to stay in this room." "Understood." Ostroff left. Dani sat down in the chair beside Reed's bed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The dog chose you in the bay." "He responded to a signal," Dani said. "My brother's a former handler. I picked up some things." "What kind of signal?" "The settle command. Palm down, fingers flat, held low." She held her hand out briefly, the gesture automatic. "I didn't think about it. It just came out." Reed looked at the ceiling. Vex has never done that with someone outside the program. Ostroff explained why. "She gave you the technical explanation." He turned his head toward her fully, which cost him something small that he absorbed without acknowledgement. "The technical explanation is incomplete." "How so?" "It's not just the signal, it's whether the signal comes from somewhere real." He paused. "Vex doesn't respond to someone imitating a handler. He responds to someone who's actually been in that world, who's actually cared about it. A beat. You were in it for your brother." Dani didn't answer immediately. She thought about the drives up to Brody's house, the months of weekends, the 3 dogs she'd learned to read, the paracord bracelet she'd never once taken off. The way she'd kept all of it quiet because talking about it felt like claiming credit for someone else's sacrifice. "He got hurt," she said. "I showed up." "That's not nothing," Reed said. "I know." Vex, at the foot of the bed, raised his head and looked at the door. Both ears forward, body marginally tensed, not alarm, but attention. Gathering information the way he always did, quietly, without requiring anyone's permission. Dani's phone buzzed. "Ostroff, we have him. Building 2nd floor, coming in now." 40 seconds later, from somewhere below them, the sounds came through the structure. Voices, rapid and controlled, the specific cadence of a federal entry. Not dramatic, efficient. Reed heard it too. His eyes didn't move from the ceiling, but something in his face settled, the particular quality of a man who had been holding a shape for a very long time and was finally allowing himself, cautiously, to stop. "It's done," she said. He exhaled, slowly and all the way. The man apprehended in the building was named Teal Cranford. He was 53 years old, formerly attached to a private intelligence contractor with federal clients, and he had on his phone 6 weeks of encrypted communication with Stoltz and a network of 4 additional contacts that took the NCIS digital forensics team nearly 3 days to fully map. The breach in Reed Galveston's unit, as it emerged, had been operating for 4 months. The shooting that had put him on the gurney was reactive. Someone trying to eliminate the one operator who'd noticed that the unit's operational data was landing somewhere it shouldn't. Reed had been keeping records. Not an encrypted drive, not a separate system, a personal log, handwritten, stored at his mother's house in a lockbox she'd had since the 80s and had never been asked to open. Ostroff retrieved it with his authorization on the second day. Its contents matched Cranford's communication logs with a precision that had taken 4 months of careful, quiet documentation to build. The work of a man who had reported something real, been told he was wrong, and responded not by accepting the dismissal but by building the case in silence while the people who'd dismissed him continued to trust him. Dani learned most of this from Ostroff during a formal, recorded interview that lasted 90 minutes and covered everything from the ambulance bay to the moment she'd heard the federal team move through the second floor. She answered everything in sequence, without embellishment, in the same chair she'd sat in that morning. The agent conducting the interview, not Ostroff, an older one from a different unit, took notes by hand and asked follow-ups that were precise in the way that told her he'd read significant documentation before sitting down with her. At the end, he set his pen down and said, "The actions you took over the past 16 hours, identifying Stoltz, the room transfer, the threat assessment, these contributed materially to an operation that has been running for 4 months. The outcome would have looked very different without your involvement." Dani said, "I was doing my job. Trauma nursing. Yes, and my job in that room is to notice what other people have stopped looking for." He looked at her for a moment. The record will reflect that. She drove home at noon, slept for 11 hours, fed the cat she'd forgotten to arrange care for, which hadn't seemed to cause the cat significant distress, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window with her left hand wrapped around the mug and the paracord bracelet resting against her wrist the way it always did, the way she'd long since stopped noticing. Then she called Brody. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear the television in the background, the low-volume murmur of daytime programming he kept on because the house was too quiet otherwise. "Hey," he said, "how was the shift?" She told him. She told him about the bay at 3:22 in the morning and the dog that stopped everyone and then looked at her. She told him about the signal she'd used without thinking. She told him about Ostroff's explanation, the scent profile, the behavioral cues, the way Vex had processed her as someone who belonged in that world because of the years she'd spent in it secondhand, through Brody, for Brody, because of Brody. She told him about the bracelet. There was a long silence on the other end, long enough that she almost said something to fill it. Then Brody said, "You used the settle command." It wasn't a question. Yes. Another pause, palm down, fingers flat. "That's the one." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing. The slightly uneven breath he'd had since the accident, the one that was better than it used to be, but still wasn't what it had been. "You know," he said, "I never actually told you what that signal means to a working dog. The actual meaning, the way they understand it." "No." "It means, I'm here, I see you, you can stand down." A pause. "You told that dog he could stand down, and he believed you, because you actually meant it." Dani didn't say anything. The coffee had gone cold. She didn't notice. "Good girl," Brody said. It took her a second to realize he meant her. For the first time in 2 years, since the accident, since the drives up, since the months of weekends, and the 3 foster dogs, and the hours of not saying the things that needed to be said, she laughed. And then he laughed, and the sound of it was the kind of ordinary that had been so long overdue it felt like something entirely new. 3 months later, Dani was finishing a chart at the end of a 12-hour when Flo came to the nursing station and said, with the particular careful neutrality of someone delivering information They weren't sure how to categorize that there were two visitors in the waiting room who weren't patients. She found them near the window, Reed Galveston in civilian clothes, moving better than he had any right to be, holding his left side with the unself-conscious habit of someone whose body still remembered being opened and had not entirely forgiven it. Beside him, in a service vest with the orange identifier visible, Vex sat watching the room with the same quality of calm attention he brought to everything. She stopped in the doorway. Reed turned, saw her, and crossed the room without hurrying. "You look tired," he said. "You look better than you should." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket, carefully, managing the left side, and produced a plain white envelope. He held it out. "From Ostroff," he said. "Formal commendation, federal level. Your name, your specific contributions, the full timeline." A pause. "It's not public, won't be, but anyone with clearance to look will find it. What you did is documented. It's real." She took it, held it for a moment without opening it. She thought about what it contained, not the paper, which was just paper, but the fact of it, the record. The formal institutional acknowledgement of what she'd done, made by people with the authority to make that acknowledgement mean something. She thought about every time in 6 years she'd been told she was good at her job in a way that meant for what you are, and not on the merits. Every time her instincts had been accurate, and the credit had dissolved into the general functioning of the shift. Every time she'd noticed something that mattered and had it absorbed without attribution. None of that was why she'd walked toward that gurney at 3:22 in the morning. She'd walked toward it because there was a man dying and a dog that had made a decision, and the situation required someone to move. That was the whole of it. The commendation was real, and she was glad it existed, and she would have done every part of those 16 hours without it. She put the envelope in her scrub pocket. "There's a protocol development program," she said, "at Hartfield. Civilian military handoff procedures for cases that come through outside the standard base hospital system. I've been asked to consult on the intake protocols, specifically the gap that exists when military working dogs accompany patients into civilian trauma settings and the receiving staff has no framework for it." "There's a gap," Reed said. "There was. There's going to be less of one." She looked at him directly. "I spent a long time wondering if I was in the right place. If the skills I'd built around my brother's situation were actually useful in a real clinical setting, or if I was just someone who'd gotten good at looking like she belonged. And now, I don't wonder about that anymore." "Good," he said, simply without decoration. Vex moved from Reed's left side to her left side and sat down against her leg. The simple animal decision to put his weight against something he had determined was solid. She felt it through her scrubs. She didn't move away from it. She looked down at him. He looked up at her with the particular quality of attention she had come to understand as his version of acknowledgement. Not performance, not training, just recognition, offered from a creature that didn't have the capacity to offer anything false. She put her hand on his head briefly, the way Brody had taught her. And the dog, who had stopped every person in that bay at 3:22 in the morning, leaned into her palm and stayed.